Do we have to install?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Perez, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Dialectical Behavior Therapy and Substance Use Applications. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the Q&A panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the Q&A panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. If you can mute your computer or phone, please. Thank you. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options will be posted in the chat panel too. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen, as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 10 business days. To access the recording, go to www.fada.org. Also, a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to participants within that same time frame. Sorry about that. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. The information you provide FADA as part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 10 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. The evaluation is very important, everyone, if you would like to receive CE credits. Also, if you do not receive the survey after the webinar, please do not hesitate to contact us. Do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Tuesday, August 13th. 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you're a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside the state of Florida, you don't need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Note, please, that WebEx monitors arrival and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of this event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to provide partial credit. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Mr. Christopher Conley. Christopher Conley is a clinical social worker and is certified through the DBT Linehan Board of Certification as a certified clinician. He has over 18 years of experience working in a wide range of services, including child welfare, emergency psychiatry, outpatient mental health, juvenile justice, and implementing evidence-based treatments in community services. He has been providing comprehensive DBT treatment since 2005 with adolescents and adults. Currently, Christopher volunteers for the DBT Linehan Board of Certification as an adherence coder. He is experienced in a number of behavioral and cognitive behavioral treatments, including prolonged exposure for PTSD, exposure and response prevention for OCD, and treatments for mood and anxiety disorders. He is an approved PE consultant and supervisor with Dr. Edna Foa. In addition to his clinical work and consultation services, Christopher is an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University, where he has supervised psychiatry residents in DBT and taught medical students interviewing skills, applied ethics, and evidence-based practice. He has led many DBT trainings for teams and individuals and is actively involved in funded research studies. And now I would like to turn the presentation over to Christopher Conley.
Well, thank you so much. That was a lengthy introduction. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. If you can't hear me, type into the chat or the question and answer area there, and we will try to figure that out as we go along. I am just really excited to be presenting to you on this material today. I'm hoping it's interesting. We got a really tight timeline. I think we're going to break for about 5 minutes when we're about an hour in thereabouts. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to throw them in the question and answer piece. I might not be able to get to all of them, but we will be able to tally them and be able to address them as we go along. So let me see here if I can switch up these slides. Perfect. So learning objectives. We have some learning objectives for you today, and make sure if it's not crystal clear in your mind, these bullet points here by the time that we wrap up, or at least by break, because most of these things should be covered by the time we break, let me know. Our game plan is really to go through some of the research on DBT for substance use disorders on the front end, and then some of the specifics. We were trying to tailor this to more of an advanced-based seminar, learning focus. I'm hoping for most of you that will be your experience, especially if you're an experienced DBT clinician. I'm curious about folks and how many people are part of a weekly DBT consultation team. Now, if you might have just joined and your microphone is unmuted, just click that mute button there. Perfect. How many people belong to a DBT consultation team where they're meeting weekly with other DBT providers and really applying the treatment on one another so that you stay in the treatment and you're providing the different modes and functions of the treatment? My hope is that this is the audience. For some of you, that might apply to. For some of you, you just might be curious and tuning in. So we'll hopefully strike a balance. My experience in teaching, advanced DBT is often actually just reviewing the fundamentals because DBT is such a big, gigantic treatment. It is a large treatment. It's a wonder that it ever made it out of Dr. Lenahan's teaching laboratory and treatment clinic at the University of Washington because there are so many components to it. And so oftentimes I think what people find as advanced training is often really cleaning up their understanding from the original treatment manual. I do want to just highlight the treatment manuals perhaps before we go too much further. There are 3 manuals that you should be aware of. The first treatment manual, which I did not bring home with me in doing this webinar today, is the original manual called Cognitive Behavioral Treatment of Borderline Personality Disorder. It's published in 1993 by Guilford Press, and it's by Marcia M. Linehan. It is about 500 and some odd pages. It's only available in hardcover, has a red cover with a silhouette of what looks like a woman's face. So that is the treatment manual. I'm surprised by how many people say, well, I do DBT treatment, but they've actually never read the manual. So you have got to read the manual. And if you're really quite diligent about DBT, you have got to probably read about once or twice every year thereabouts. It is so dense and it's so thick, and each time you read it, you kind of get a new perspective each time in reading it. The newer manuals for the skills training, though, are this. This is the DBT Skills Training Manual, the second edition by Guilford Press, released in 2014, 2015. This is the book that has all the information on how to run skills group and how to teach the various skills, including the substance use skills, which were left out of the original manual. They hadn't been developed at that time fully. And this is the skills training handouts and worksheets that clients and people that we work with would get and use and work through. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about dialectical behavior therapy. Of course, DBT has this polarized view in the concept of dialectics, that these opposites can be true at the same time. And the 2 big dialectics inside DBT, although there's many, is acceptance and change. And broadly, we have over on the acceptance side in DBT, validation, the incorporation of Zen mindfulness practice, problem acceptance, appropriate self-disclosure, support, at times environmental intervention. And over on the change side, we have essentially all of the behavioral and cognitive behavioral strategies of problem solving, benevolently demanding that the folks we work with change now in the interest of getting their life to be how they want it to be. Oftentimes, sometimes some punchy or irreverent communication, which I think is unique to DBT. It certainly differentiates a lot of DBT from cognitive behavior therapy, at least in my observation of it. There's a speed and flow to DBT that is just faster, and I would say is just more, comes off perhaps with our clients as being more authentic. And if it doesn't, we got other problems then. So let's look at this unique population of individuals who might meet the criteria for borderline personality disorder and also substance use disorder. Now, I'm going to go through this slide just quickly and then make a little caveat or a little asterisk around borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder and people who meet criteria for that in the general population, perhaps the largest study was done by Mary Zanarini and her colleagues. She's out in Harvard, and they surveyed about 30,000 people using a measure to try to determine what is the prevalence of borderline personality disorder in the general population. It's about 6%. And they also looked at adolescents in that study, and understandably, it was not as high of a percentage, about 3 or 4%. When we look at borderline personality disorder in substance use populations, we see a wide range from various studies between about 10% and 65% in treatment samples, and about 10% of those to 12 meeting criteria for opioid or opiate addiction. Now, if I just pause for a moment here, it is worthwhile to note that when dialectical behavior therapy was developed by Marsha Linehan, when she was basically crafting her behavior therapy for suicidal people, she didn't know anything about borderline personality disorder, and this isn't a top secret. This is, a public domain, because she's a behaviorist. She really cares about, what can I work on in the session. As behavioral treatment providers or as behavior therapists, we're really looking at what is the behavior in terms of a thought, emotion, cognition, action that's happening that is interfering with how somebody wants their life to be. So she essentially developed the entirety of her treatment not knowing anything about borderline personality disorder. The only reason that DBT really got married to borderline personality disorder in a way, maybe it's more common law, to be honest, is that when she went to the National Institute of Mental Health for funding to look at evaluating the efficacy of her treatment, at that time, the National Institute of Mental Health required studies to be connected to a diagnosis. And in classic Marsha Linehan fashion, she was trying to figure out, well, what is my population? Are they very severely depressed people who are suicidal? Or, I don't know what this is necessarily. What should I go for? And if your microphone's unmuted, you just might want to mute that. And so what happened is that one of her grad students said, I think you are treating individuals who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. And Marsha said, well, of course I am. And then she went to the library, because that's what she did in the late 80s, and looked up what was borderline personality disorder and said, well, yes, this might be a fitting population that I am working with. So the reality is perhaps DBT has really assisted in being an evidence-based treatment for individuals with borderline personality disorder, and hopefully has helped, a good population of those folks. And it was not also created to treat people who had borderline personality disorder. And even now, it is a treatment for people who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. And at the same time, it's also a treatment for individuals who just have many, many problems in living, whether it's multiplicity of diagnostic problems from DSM-5, for example, that just can't fit into other treatments. They just have too many challenges to be managed easily in another evidence-based treatment. DBT would also be the treatment for them. Okay, so we see high prevalence amongst substance use disorders in individuals who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. About 1 in 5 in a clinical population met criteria in 85 study. Similarly, Paul Links looked at across a lifetime, would people meet criteria for substance use disorders, and it was, again, at least about 1 in 5. And, the largest incidence here was that up to 67% of people who met criteria for substance use disorder, with borderline personality disorder, also met criteria for substance use disorder. And it only dropped to about 57% if you dropped substance use problems as part of the DSM. Would have been DSM 4 or 3R criteria at that time. It didn't actually reduce that much. It was quite a prevalent group of individuals who overlapped. And so what we found out, both from Michael Stone and Paul Link's research in individuals who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder and substance use disorder, is that it's greater than the sum of its parts, that the individuals who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder and substance use disorders have greater psychopathology. They meet more criteria for more diagnostic labels, so to speak, from DSM-5, and they are at much higher risk of suicidal behavior than individuals who just meet criteria for borderline personality disorder or substance use disorders. We can see here in Michael Stone's study in 2010, whereas individuals who meet criteria for BPD might have a suicide rate around 10%, most of which occurring in their mid-20s to early 30s, that this increases the risk of completed suicide increases almost 40% if the individual has meets criteria for alcohol dependence and they're not attending AA, which is huge. This is a very high risk population. Michael Stone's longitudinal study, I think he has about 4 and a bit decades of following a group of individuals who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder, did observe some protective factors, one being artistic talent, the other is high IQ, over 130. Now, for those of you who know IQ, the average population is normed at 100. And so these are actually folks that are a number of T-scores higher than the average population. Conventionally attractive folks and people who have good self-management skills. Perhaps not surprisingly, individuals who had greater risk factors in terms of eventual suicide would be transgenerational incest, history of sexual assault, especially cruel parents, a night in jail, antisocial or unlawful behaviors, multiplicity of unlawful behaviors, and in men who had eloped or left against medical advice from hospital. So if we think of DBT then, what is DBT substance use disorders for? It's really for this group of folks who are substance dependent, who have severe and complex problems, and often individuals who meet a criteria for a personality disorder. There was a number of NIDA studies showing the efficacy of this. This study that was completed in Amsterdam, they had good outcomes, although they did not necessarily specify or treat substance use. They had a reduction in alcohol use, but they didn't target other substances. And they found out from that Amsterdam study that if you don't target the substance, what happens? Well, the substance doesn't go down. So you really actually have to target, and in DBT substance use, target substance use in the individual DBT session. So again, DBT is for the multi-problem, typically multi-severe problem individual. It is mostly an abstinence-based treatment, although we're going to talk about this because we really employ this idea of dialectical abstinence. So we'll get to that. The idea here is, applying DBT when you need to apply DBT, when you have to have somebody in a DBT substance use program. DBT's got a big house of evidence-based treatment procedures and processes that work with folks who have multiple problems. If you don't require DBT, use another evidence-based treatment. If you don't have severely multi-disordered complex clients, use a more parsimonious treatment that's going to work. If you have folks who have multiple diagnoses, multiple problems in lots of different areas, then DBT is likely going to be the strategy or the treatment, the evidence-based treatment to pull for in that situation. Perhaps one of the ways to think about, if you move away from a diagnostic idea of DBT is for people who have borderline personality disorder plus substance use disorder, is Marsha Linehan's breakdown of areas of dysregulation. And the way I like to think of this is the more areas of dysregulation your client has, and the more severity in each of those areas, the more likely they're a pretty decent candidate for DBT. And if they have substance dependence, DBT for substance use. Now, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this breakdown of areas of dysregulation. Essentially, this was Dr. Linehan's attempt to really behaviorally operationalize the DSM-4 criteria for borderline personality disorder. The way that I view this, though, and I think it's a helpful paradigm or way to conceptualize this, is that these are areas in which people that we interface with might have problems in any one of these areas. The more of these that they have, the more severe your client are. The more severe the problems are, the more complex your treatment typically has to be. So just quickly, under emotion dysregulation, this would be any mood or anxiety disorder that exists, in addition to the inability to regulate emotions. And what I mean by that, and what DBT tends to mean by that, is despite someone's best efforts, their inability to reduce the duration of an emotion, the intensity of an emotion, or the frequency of an emotion, which at the root is really the case formulation or conceptualization of individuals who are in DBT that they fundamentally suffer from an emotional dysregulation problem, which then spurs perhaps many of these other areas of dysregulation. Behavioral dysregulation is where substance use would fall. This would also include impulsive behavior. So I think of, binging, purging, drinking, drugging, hooking up in an unwise way with people. Anything that is behaviorally observable, action-based, is going to fall under that category. Aggression, getting into fights, those kinds of things. Cognitive dysregulation in this context means thinking problems that are typically more transient. We're not talking about psychotic disorders or individuals who might meet criteria for schizophrenia or psychotic or manic episodes if they have a bipolar disorder. We're talking about more cognitive distortions and also transitory paranoid thinking or very black and white thinking, the ways in which thinking basically can become dysregulated or ineffective. Interpersonal, this is just relational problems and chaos that can come. And self-dysregulation, it's perhaps not surprising that if somebody at the root has difficulty with emotion dysregulation for the reasons that we'll go through in biosocial theory, that it's going to be very hard for them to understand who they are, what their values are, what's important to them, and how they fit into this world. DBT's formulation of really all challenges comes down to a biosocial theory. And the best way to think about biosocial theory, or Linehan's biosocial theory, is that there's 3 and 3. There's 3 items under biological, and there's 3 items under social. And you want to look for this in the clients that you're working with as a way of conceptualizing, okay, one, do they seem to, is this the kind of client that's going to work well, or the kind of person that's going to work well in DBT? And is this what I'm observing? What are my examples of this? The first is sensitivity to emotion cues. Now, we understand this to be a combination of genetic factors, perhaps environmental factors that influence our genetics that we're just not in control of. That some people are just born with sensitivity to emotion cues in a way that other folks aren't. And that when those cues show up, that their emotions become more reactive. They go higher and they go high quick. And it takes a long time for them to return to a baseline state, right? So they go sensitive, so it gets going high, it gets going fast, and it takes a long time for that emotion to reduce, actually, on its own. So that's the 3 points for biological. The 3 points for social is really that the individual has, and this is primarily referencing families of origin, though it doesn't have to, has a pervasive experience of invalidation. Pervasive invalidation. Naturally, many of you might be thinking about, well, is this, physical or sexual abuse in some way? Well, it could be, because that is obviously invalidation in various ways. And it's a form of pervasive invalidation, but it doesn't have to be. The 3 points around the invalidating environment is really that the environment pervasively punishes or ridicules or ignores an individual's private experiences. Private experiences mostly referring to emotions and thoughts, right? Those are the experiences that are private to us. Regardless of the actual validity of those emotions, emotion expression, or thoughts that someone has. So that's point 1. The second point, which you can think of in a lot of different ways, is that some environments either ignores or punishes the expression of emotion, okay, until it becomes so high or so intense or so big that then everything kind of descends on it and it accidentally gets reinforced. So reinforcement once in a while of up-escalated emotion expression. I see this all the time in adolescents. I see this all the time in treatment providers, actually, that they've missed things on lower levels of validation of displays of emotion. And, either the therapist or the parent or the caregiver or the significant other really only pays attention when it's very, very high emotion expression. And then we get into this problem where high emotion expression is now the default. The brain doesn't kind of have a gradient or have a gradualness to it. It goes kind of from 0 to 100 really fast. If you think of this, maybe a simplistic or slightly mechanistic explanation might be taking your kid to the grocery store, and you take them at supper time because, I don't know, parents, we do this kind of thing. And we haven't fed them yet, and they're hungry, and they're going through the aisles, and the kiddo says, I'm hungry, I'm really hungry, and the parent might ignore it. Yes, yes, yes. Wait, 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 wait. Until that hunger pain gets so high that the checkout line, they lose their ever loving mind. And they say, I'm hungry. I want that candy bar. I want it now. And they're having a meltdown. The parents' distress is increasing because they're actually probably experiencing embarrassment or shame. The kids, hungry, they've kind of had their concern around their hunger a little bit ignored through it, and the parent shame gets so high, the kid's expression gets so high, the parent gives the candy at the checkout aisle, the kid quiets down, the parents reinforce for the kid quieting down because their shame goes down. But the up escalation of that expression of behavior is actually now reinforced. And now, in a similar situation, next time, perhaps even without the hunger pains necessarily, the kid's brain, this is without intent, might go to that high emotion expression. All right. So, this is the same sort of concept. And the final piece, and I have to admit, as therapists, we can be very problematic on this as well, is oversimplification of problem solving. If you have an individual who, back here is very sensitive to emotion cues, very reactive with a slow return to baseline, problem solving is actually not simple. And it's not simple for the vast majority of people, but it's especially not simple for folks who are exquisitely sensitive to emotion and very reactive to emotion cues. And so the invalidating environment communicates unrealistic expectations of problem solving, and it's usually something along the lines of willpower. If you just worked harder, you'd be more successful in that. In adolescence, or if you hear about a social learning history, it's often communicated in, if only you were the way that your sibling was. If you were more like your sibling, then you would be you'd be better able to manage these problems. Just try harder. This oversimplification of problem solving really sets the groundwork and is a way of being pervasively invalidating. And it also sets the groundwork for the next things that we see. For people who hopefully, if you've had some more intensive DBT training and you've read the manual, you would know about secondary targets or dialectical dilemmas. The best way to think about this is like an overflow or a natural outcome to a pervasively invalidating environment, transactionally interacting with this biological sensitivity, reactivity, slow return to baseline. And if you think of each of these concepts of secondary targets or dialectical dilemmas, they are a class of behaviors that tends to be seen when someone has that experience. And I'm not going to go through each of these because you could probably just have a seminar discussing looking for and targeting secondary targets for dialectical dilemmas. I will say just a couple of things in general on this. One is that if you see one secondary target or dialectical dilemma, you're likely going to see the other. So watch for it in your sessions, watch for it on your chain analyses. The ones I want to focus on that are especially important in substance use disorders is the dialectical dilemma of emotion vulnerability. This is the experience of feeling emotionally out of control, kind of the experience of feeling like you don't have an emotional skin. That's what emotion vulnerability is. It's in some ways almost the trauma of being a very sensitive, reactive, emotional person. And the other end of that is self-invalidation. Self-invalidation often shows up in response to emotion vulnerability. I'm feeling intense emotion, and I shouldn't feel that way. I'm ridiculous for feeling the way that I do. And individuals end up in this up escalating transaction between I feel emotionally out of control, I shouldn't feel this way, then they feel more emotionally out of control or more emotionally intense. Because the reality is that any form of invalidation increases emotional arousal. Validation reduces emotional arousal, invalidation increases emotional arousal. Whether the environment or somebody else is being invalidating increases emotional arousal, or whether we actually self-invalidate can increase emotional arousal. So some of the common self-invalidation that you can look for is this self-loathing sort of concept. I shouldn't be this way. I'm disgusting. Look at me. Oftentimes when you hear individuals describe self-invalidation, they're often parroting back what the invalidating environment has said to them over time. And some of the behaviors that might occur in this is try to seek kind of validation with other individuals who also use substances. We see as well the denial of severity of the problem with oversimplification. I've hit rock bottom. I'm not going to do this again. I can be perfect today. Um, you know, this is over. I'm finished with this substance use or finished with whatever this problem is that we were targeting. In fact, I'm so done with it, we don't even have to talk about it. I'm sure many of you are thinking of this right now in relationship to clients that you've worked with. Now, I want to highlight before we go much further into the throes, we've gone through some of the research, some of the conceptualization from a biosocial perspective, and some specific dialectical or secondary targets relevant to substance use disorder, the prevalence of PTSD in substance use. I'm sure most of you know this already. I want to highlight two related theorists, Edna Foa and Melanie Harned. So Edna Foa came up with prolonged exposure. She's done a number of research studies now where they've embedded prolonged exposure inside substance use treatment. You know, prior to this time, there's such a high comorbidity of PTSD and substance use. You know, there was often this, you know, when you stop using substances, then we can treat your PTSD. And at times, you know, that might need to be the reality depending on how, you know, frequent or out of control the behavior is. But there's now been a number of studies done where individuals might continue to use substances, but they crack a window of 2 to 3 hours before their session and after their session, and when doing their homework in session. This is for prolonged exposure, which is, you know, perhaps the most researched treatment for PTSD. It has good results as well. And those folks actually did quite well. They did well when they were being treated with prolonged exposure and naltrexone. Their substance use reduced, and also their PTSD reduced, and for many folks eliminated. That was Edna Foa's studies. And then Melanie Harned came along and said, geez, you know, we have got to think of a way in which to be able to treat PTSD perhaps earlier with individuals who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder who are in DBT, and how do we do this? And she came up with a 6-point criteria. This is, I think, a very helpful criteria in trying to figure out, do I move into an evidence-based treatment for PTSD? The treatment that Melanie Harned used was prolonged exposure, and it worked very well with this population who had lots and lots of problems, prone to dissociation, all sorts of difficulties that tend to be somewhat of culturally thinking, a bit of an exclusionary criteria. She found that it wasn't. And her 6 criteria that people had to meet was you had to be not at imminent risk of suicide, no suicide or self-harm behaviors in the past 8 weeks, no serious therapy interfering behavior, that's coming to session, participating in session reasonably, not that it's perfect, a willingness to experience intense emotions without literally running out of the room or escaping, that the client wants to treat PTSD, and it is the highest quality of life interfering behavior. Now, this is where we see substance use and DBT on quality of life interfering behavior. You really got to do a diligent assessment of which is actually interfering more in someone's quality of life. And sometimes you actually got to treat both at the same time, which was back to Dr. Foa's original studies. Okay, so here's for some takeaways here. So some differences with individuals who have substance use disorders and meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. The first is, well, people who have borderline personality disorder have a high avoidance of cues and prompting events and triggers that generate negative emotional states. Individuals with substance use disorders and who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder are all the more intense on this, especially the emotion of shame. Shame or embarrassment, the sense of potentially being kicked out. The reality is that substances regulate emotions much faster than most of our DBT skills are going to, I would say all of our skills. This isn't abnormal or untrue even in self-injurious behavior. Self-injurious behavior for the vast majority of folks is going to work faster than any DBT skill that we're going to teach. So we have got to help them bridge the gap with commitment strategies to use these perhaps slower, less effective strategies instead of life-destroying behaviors. Individuals with substance use disorders, now my suspicion is that folks who work primarily with substance use disorders knew this all the time. I think when Dr. Linehan and Dr. Demuth were developing DBT for substance use disorders, they might not have anticipated this so much, is that there's frequent fallout or falling out of contact with their primary therapist. That for individuals who met criteria for borderline personality disorder, it was easier to keep them engaged in the treatment because they liked treatment. They liked coming to sessions. You could increase the intensity of the relationship by booking another session with them, perhaps later in that week. And individual substance use disorders, people were not necessarily therapists in hospitals in the same way that individuals who met criteria for borderline personality disorder. There's a piece of that, but that the vast majority of individuals, their community, were individuals who they use substances with. Of course, therapists, even more so than perhaps the general DBT therapists, are more prone to feeling demoralized or apathetic, perhaps judgmental, I would say, with this population in particular. And that individuals with substance use disorders have, of course, just far fewer positive social supports to rely on. So it makes the treatment more difficult compared to individuals who just had met criteria for borderline personality disorder. All right. So in DBT for substance use disorders, the treatment goal is really abstinence and increased functionality while we're working on addressing higher order targets and building a reasonable quality of life or life worth living. That is the goal of all DBT. And all the problems essentially in DBT are problems that the client identifies that are interfering with how they want their life to be. If it's not relevant to the client, it really in a DBT perspective, outside of suicide or immediate, life-threatening behavior or life-threatening behavior of somebody else's in homicide, if it's not relevant to that, then it's really not relevant. If it's not relevant to their quality of life, then it's not really relevant to the DBT therapist. We've got to order up our treatments in the specific problems that are interfering with people's life and how they want life to be. And so in DBT, after commitment to do the treatment happens, this is why we have this treatment hierarchy. This is what gets the attention inside of a DBT individual session. Not necessarily in a DBT skills group, that's a different hierarchy, targeting hierarchy, but in an individual session, imminent life-threatening behavior or homicidal behavior has got to be the top most important thing that we address. If somebody is dead or someone else is going to be dead and someone's going to be in jail as a result, then nothing else really matters. Dead people don't require treatment. So this is the most important target, always, imminent life-threatening behavior. Then it's decreasing therapy interfering behavior. This is anything that is making therapy hard for the therapist to provide, but this also includes any behavior that the therapist is doing that the client finds hard. So in DBT is a treatment of equals, amongst equals. We're equal people, not necessarily equal power, but equal people. And so in DBT, the DBT therapist has really got to be open to discussing their own therapy interfering behavior when their client brings it up. When you're late to a session, well, that's therapy interfering behavior. If it's bogging down treatment and your client's getting frustrated, it's reducing their motivation to come to treatment, you've got to be willing to talk about it and problem solve it with your client when they bring it up, certainly, and also be monitoring it for yourself. Having said that, the vast majority of what we want to get to inside DBT, whether DBT, as it was originally written or DBT for substance use, is really in treating quality of life interfering behaviors. Quality of life interfering behaviors are everything else in treatment that's not life-threatening, imminent, or therapy interfering behaviors. These are the problems like PTSD, substance use disorders. Individuals who have substance use disorders, typically the highest in their hierarchy of their quality of life interfering behavior is going to be substance use disorders. This is also things like housing. This is things like meaningful relationships. These are all the things that contribute to a poor quality of life. Really, we want to be able to have imminent life-threatening behavior under control, therapy interfering behavior under control in order to get to this quality of life interfering behavior. And then the last target inside of the DBT individual session is increasing DBT behavioral skills. Part of biosocial theory lets us understand that people, because of their genetics and the transaction with an invalidating environment, often result in a skills deficit, not knowing what to do and how to do it. So we have got to increase behavioral skills to help compensate for this natural outcome from a biosocial history where people come to see us. Okay, so in DBT substance use specifically, we make a number of additional requests. So in DBT proper, individuals have got to be willing to, at least in principle, stop, eliminate, and reduce all suicide and self-injurious behavior. They say, no, that is never going to be a goal. I'm not doing that. And we use lots of commitment strategies to try to get an agreement on self-injurious behaviors. Someone flat out says no, and I very rarely have this happen, then they're not accepted into DBT. We can't really treat somebody without consent, and we really need their consent to treat these targets. So in DBT substance use, we have that commitment, plus we have an agreement to work on therapy interfering behavior of you as the treatment provider, and also any treatment interfering behavior that the client has. Okay, we have to have agreement to problem solve that, but then we need some additional agreements. In the original studies, these were the agreements that were made, is to get off of all illegal substances. You have to get an explicit agreement to not sell substances to other people in the program, and that they have to come to treatment sessions, especially groups, DBT skills groups, appearing sober. If you make a contingency or a consequence that if you've used, you can't come, then, lo and behold, no one's going to come because they might use, sometimes on purpose to not attend, but their use might just be so frequent that they're not going to come. And in the original studies, there was medication-assisted treatment. It was actually methadone in the first study, and also urine analysis. The urine analysis, the medication-assisted treatment was not contingent on the urine analysis. They just did the urine analysis. And an agreement to target these higher order targets in DBT, which is therapy interfering behavior and suicidal behavior. So, the most important thing in getting this going is to know how your client wants their life to be. What would a life worth living be to them? Knowing how incredibly difficult behavior change is at the best of times and how difficult it is to stop substances, we've got to figure out why would they want to do this? What do they want their life to be? How do they want their life to be? Some people think this is a little bit like the miracle question. I don't think it's that way necessarily. I usually spend a good deal of time on this, perhaps 20 to 30 minutes. I want a very vivid, very image-based description of how they want their life to be, who's in their life, who's out of their life, what's in their closet for clothes that they want to wear, what kind of car they want to drive, or public transportation, where they're going to be living in a life that they would be less prone to use substances and less likely to kill themselves. Where actually, in fact, if they were diagnosed with a near terminal illness, that they would actively seek out treatment to keep their life alive for longer because there's so much anchoring them to the earth. I want a very vivid and extremely vivid description of this. I want to know the color of the car that they want to drive. I want to know what kind of job they want. I want to know how people are interfacing with them at their job. A life worth living goal is not graduating high school or finishing college. Those things are good, but they're in order to do something. And so I want to have a very clear understanding of how they want their life to be. And this is going to be very important for motivation, for motivational enhancement while you're in the treatment. The essence of this is that in order to get this life, stopping these drugs or stopping these substances is required, and connecting these pieces. So connecting the dots. In order to have a life where you are a high school teacher and you're helping kids learn, in order to do that, and you have this spouse who loves you, and when you get home and their face lights up and they say, tell me all about your day, and they're emotionally supportive, in order to get that, you need to do this. This is, for DBT savvy folks, this is contingency clarification. It's going to be hard to do this. The reality is if stopping substances were easy, you would have done it. Okay? And then we're going to use actually commitment strategies to increase individuals' commitment to stopping the substances. And this last point here, you could decide it's too hard. You could turn back, is a devil's advocate strategy. So I want to go through some of the commitment strategies inside DBT. They're very different in many ways from what you might, well, they're different and they're similar. I guess they're dialectical of what you might have think of in typical motivational interviewing. DBT doesn't really have a motivational interviewing framework to it. Um, what could I say? It also really doesn't have a theoretical model of change framework to it. The essence of both the DBT studies for suicidal and self-harming people and for substances where, people pulled a little handout saying, do you have a substance use problem? Might you want to treat it? Call this number. And the essence of those initial treatment trials, which occurred in a research context, was to get people's agreement to the treatment in the first session. And so, where we might think of getting ready for change and pre contemplation, all those stages of change inside, married to motivational interviewing, DBT is a little more obtuse. It jumps the gun. It takes somebody who is perhaps not even contemplating any change and makes high requests for them to change, and then uses commitment strategies to shape up their verbal commitment to it. Okay? So this is saying things along the lines of, this substance has really destroyed your life. Alcohol use, every time you use it, from what you've told me, is completely ruining things for you. I think we need to make a commitment to stop it all entirely, to stop it now. That this is like the last day of using alcohol. Now, as soon as someone says yes to this, and you're connecting the dots because you know how they want their life to be, you've hopefully done a really detailed assessment of how the substance is interfering with that. And if it is destroying, describing it as destroying. And then using commitment strategies after somebody either agrees to or on the way to agreeing. So, the most common commitment strategy I would say that is used is the devil's advocate. So this is really that someone either agrees to or is not agreeing to, and you play the other side. Now, the trick with devil's advocate is that you pitch the arguments for, the devil's advocate a little bit lower than what is believable. So saying something like, it's going to be, if they say, yes, I'm willing to stop drinking, say, it's going to be super hard. This, in fact, might be the hardest thing that you've ever done before in your life. Do you think you're up to it? It's going to require a lot of treatment, a lot of us working together very intensely. That's a devil's advocate strategy. Classically, doing the pros and cons of stopping behavior, continuing alcohol use, stopping alcohol use, for example. Foot in the door in the face techniques. Foot in the door is asking for a little bit. Okay, they agree to that, and then you ask for more. And then typically you end up someplace in the middle. Connecting present commitments to prior commitments. This is really where we're using a lot of the life worth living that we've had them articulate. We've worked with them. We have this very clear idea of how they want their life to be, and connecting that to the problem at hand right now. Highlighting the freedom to choose in absence of alternatives. I'm pretty clear with clients whether I'm doing DBT substance use or DBT for multi-problem suicidal folks, that they don't have to do this treatment. That I'm actually not interested in doing treatment with people who are not willing to or wanting to do the treatment. I think it's one of the worst things in the world to feel like you're forced to do something. That is highlighting really a freedom to choose. And there's a dialectical strategy of perhaps highlighting the absence of alternatives. So sometimes the treatment that we might propose is very, very difficult. And I might say, look, if there was a simpler way to do this, I'd give it to you for sure. What other choices do we have right now? So sometimes that is highlighting the absence of other alternatives. Shaping is simply taking a basic agreement and increasing that agreement with reinforcement strategies as we go along. So DBT different than motivational interviewing in that we are big and kind of somewhat confrontational and ask for big changes at once and use commitment strategies to solidify that agreement. So let's talk about dialectical abstinence, and then we'll be coming up to a break, I think, at around 11. Dialectical abstinence is, DBT is mostly an abstinence-based model for the substance that is destroying someone's life. It's not to say we don't do harm reduction on other substances, but really, if somebody has lost their, life, how they had their life, how they wanted their life to be, to a substance, that is typically the substance that we're going to make a big request to go abstinence on. There are folks who might elect to do harm reduction on other substances. And you want to be clear in your mind about the extent to which those substances are either in the interest of this more problematic substance and how much it's interfering with their life. They want to be clear in their own mind about that. You're going to use good behavioral interviewing and commitment strategies to figure that out. So the idea around total abstinence is this, is that the individual is committed to and not using only before use, only in the moment. Only in this moment are we not using. Okay? And then if use does occur, we flip over to harm reduction. Okay? And only in the moment, in the interest of getting back to abstinence. Let's see if I can do this really somewhat quick. Okay, so we know the benefits of an abstinence model is that individuals who employ an abstinence model, they have an increased length of time until their next use. That's great, okay? So they have longer duration of not using. The cons are what Alan Marlett coined as the abstinence violation effect, which we're going to talk about in more detail. The abstinence, we'll talk about it in the next slide. And that there can be this piece that, this idea that the capacity to cope with potential failures, that there's a deficit in skills around that. If we're not talking about harm reduction or what to do if there is a lapse, preventing it from moving into a relapse, that individuals might actually not have sufficient skills to manage a lapse. Now, Alan Marlett coined this term, the abstinence violation effect. He also coined the term, if you're not familiar, and I'm sure most of you are actually, harm reduction. The idea of harm reduction really didn't exist until Alan Marlett started saying, hey, listen, some folks are not going to fit into an abstinence-based model, and they maybe don't even have to. There's another set of strategies. For your own kind of history on this, Dr. Linda DeMeff, who is essentially my boss, but colleague at Portland DBT, developed with Marshall Linehan DBT for substance use. Linda DeMeff's doctoral supervisor was Alan Marlett. He's since passed away at the University of Washington. So if you think of DBT substance use, it is actually this marrying of two huge treatment developers in substance use and also in cognitive behavioral therapy and what is now DBT. So the abstinence violation effects occurs when individuals go abstinence and they say, yes, I'm done with this substance, it is finished, it is over, okay? And they put a great deal of both moral and kind of value, their values become attached to being abstinent. And you can think of individuals who have perhaps had abstinence for many, many years and they have a lapse. What happens? Well, first there's like tons of shame that goes along with this. And they have perhaps mentored other people. Maybe they're a sponsor in AA or an NA program or something like that. And now they've had this relapse. What happens is they attribute, the failure entirely to themselves, and that they are essentially a moral and human failure for having this lapse. That's the abstinence violation effect. And it is dangerous because individuals who have this abstinence violation effect, it doesn't matter. I've lapsed, I might as well relapse, I might as well keep going. This is the problem of the abstinence violation effect. And what we want to do actually is modulate that and reduce that so we get back to abstinence. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. Let's see if I can do this in 2 minutes. The advantages of harm reduction is, hey, we teach good skills to moderate substance use, to reduce harms, okay? And to get back to goals quickly after a slip, and that a relapse isn't actually the worst thing in the world. The cons of harm reduction, more philosophically, is that if you always think in terms of moderation, that it's not so bad, then you're more likely to use. And we know that from the research as well, is that there's less time before the next substance use. I'm going to stop there, I think, because I think we are almost right at 11. I'd love to get any feedback that you have so far. Type it in the Q&A or the chat section. and I will do my very best to look at that and respond to those questions. And I think we will resume in about 5 minutes. If there's pacing or things that are not clear to you, please let me know. Really do value your feedback and would love to make this as meaningful as possible for you.
Christopher, if you are ready, we'll reconvene the presentation.
Great. Hopefully I'm back and live. There's a handful of questions. Looks like, at least from the folks we heard from, the pacing was reasonable and okay. So we'll keep going. So the idea of total abstinence from a DBT perspective is really the idea of turning the mind and repeatedly turning the mind into absence. This drug use, this substance use is finished, it's over, it's done. And it is in some ways as the treatment provider communicating, really the worst thing that could happen is for you to return to using this substance. And using processes, and we'll talk about some of the DBT skills that we'll use to reduce the options to use and really deny any other option to use. Okay, so that is total abstinence, right, just in the moment. Okay, this is the inner commitment to not use until it's remade. Okay, now, one of the things that you can do, this is kind of the warm turkey quit, I guess, to think of this, is an option to use to be left open in the future. Now, if you do a bit of a cognitive experiment with me for a moment, I know we got a lot to go through still. I'm hoping we can nail it all off. But I want you to think of a behavior that you have found difficult to stop or to reduce. Some perhaps problematic behavior that's interfering with how your life is. It's a behavior in excess. Okay? So I want everyone to think about that for a moment right now. And I want you to just pay attention to the sensations in your body and what your brain says. Okay, hopefully you have this behavior in your mind. When I say to you, listen, this problem has got to stop. And you have got to stop it forever. It's over. It's done. It's finished. Now, if you're brave, I'm not going to ask you what the behavior is, of course. But if you're scanning your body right now and sensations and your thoughts that show up, somebody might be daring to just type in there, what did they notice? What did you notice when I made a request that you stop this behavior that's been in excess and that it's finished and that it's done forever? Now, I made a behavioral demand, so I'm going to wait till that chat or the Q&A lights up. Anybody willing to say what they experienced? A loss. Doubt I'm really able to stop this forever. Actually, someone said, I actually want to do this substance more, or I want to do this behavior more. Yep. Fear of failure, panic, of course. Right. Yes. Uncertainty, skepticism, feeling really challenged. Okay. So this is often questioning one's ability. Yeah. These are kind of almost universal responses to thinking of a behavior that's in excess and making a request to stop it right away. Now, that's not to say that we don't do that. Now, I want you to do, follow this experiment up a little bit. I want you to think to yourself, okay, how long do you think you could possibly go without doing this behavior again? Okay, what's a period of time that might be a challenge, but is realistic that you could do? Could you not do this behavior for the rest of the morning? Might that be a reasonable start? Perhaps it's an hour, 1 week. Okay, a week. Okay, great. Yes. So this is a day. Okay, perfect. So this is the idea of kind of a warm turkey quit, where we might say, listen, we know that we've got to stop this substance. Let's make this agreement to total abstinence for the rest of the afternoon. Let's make this agreement for just this hour. Somebody said just this hour, just this week. Okay? And we'll have to revisit this commitment after it's made. Okay? Now, how do you feel in your body? A little more relieved, I see. Something like, yeah, I can do it. It feels it's going to be challenging, but it's a little more realistic. For anybody who smokes, this might actually be a reasonable behavior to think of that way. It might be possible. It's possible. Great. And we can also kind of provide people, listen, if you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, you can always return to using at a later time. Of course, people can always return to using at the end of treatment. This is not too dissimilar to suicidal folks. You have everything to gain by not killing yourself in the midst of this treatment, and not a whole lot to lose. The reality, the facts of the matter are that you could always return to killing yourself after this treatment. There's very little I could do to stop that. So the promise around substances to perhaps reuse at death. Now, Marsha Linehan, publicly, this is known. She was a 3-day-a-pack smoker, and she made the agreement, listen, if I'm diagnosed with a terminal illness, I'm going back to smoking. Okay, so it's the same sort of concept here. All right. Now, when we're thinking about harm reduction, we want to be teaching the what if, just in case, the emergency preparedness drill. This is relapse prevention strategies 101. We want to teach this concept, and this is so fundamental to our folks who have had the experience of so many failures of trying to do things and either not being successful for perhaps it's lack of skill, perhaps it's actually just lack of an environment that reinforces the kind of adaptive behaviors that they need, that we all need. We all need reinforcement on our behavior. And so we want to teach this concept of failing well. This is the idea that, okay, if someone's had a lapse, we move to harm reduction and we say, listen, it's not that you had a lapse that was the problem. The reality is staying in a lapsed state. Now that's the problem. Okay, we've got to figure out what got this lapse happening. We've got to figure out how this failure of intention, you intended to do something A and you got B instead. So we've got to figure out how did this B happen. And we've got to fail well, learn from this as much as we can, gather as much data and information we can, and get back onto this abstinence. Okay? So we move abstinence, total abstinence, okay? The worst thing that could happen is use. There's a lapse, because there's lapses. Then we move to harm reduction. Listen, we got to learn how we can learn all the information we can from this lapse. We've got to be able to fail well here. Figure this out so we can get back over here. The worst thing that happened isn't that you had a lapse. The worst thing that happens is staying in a lapsed state. Okay, so we've got to figure out how to get back over here. And this isn't the big deal here. The big deal is actually not moving back, is not failing well from this. And so part of failing well is using chain analysis in DBT, which is essentially a customized analysis and relapse prevention plan unique to that relapse. So if we're thinking of a balance of these things, we're kind of front of the mind expectation of complete abstinence. Mostly as a therapist, we're thinking back of the mind, how are we going to do relapse prevention? Okay? We are balancing this idea of touchdown. We want to go completely without this substance. That is the goal here. And when we have a lapse, listen, winning isn't everything. The process is what matters. And so we're balancing these two concepts of total abstinence with harm reduction. Now, here's the late Alan Marlatt, who said, staying off substances is a process. It's not the end point. And so it can include slips. It can include lapses. This is how it goes. Now, I got to be careful with this slide here because prolapse has a different meaning than how we're meaning it here. This is the idea that you're closer to your ultimate goals of being abstinence when there's a relapse. This is how we're modulating. This is how we're reducing the problematic nature of the abstinence violation effect. I put my heart and soul into abstinence. I failed. I'm a failure. I might as well stay lapsed. Okay, we have got to modulate that, reduce that intensity very fast when there's a lapse. And so we start reframing. Listen, Problem isn't that you had a lapse here. We got to figure out how to make this as small of a lapse as possible, do everything possible to get back to abstinence. But the reality is there's probably going to be a certain number of lapses before you get your goal. And this is where Alan Marlatt would say 3 strikes and you're actually closer to your ultimate goals. You're not out. There is some undefined amount of or defined amount of lapses that the universe knows is going to happen. Let's have as few of those as possible. We don't know how many there's going to be, but there's going to be a certain number before you reach your ultimate goals. So, hey, we've just got one of those down. Now we got to figure out how to get back to abstinence. 3 strikes and you're closer to your ultimate goal. Okay. Now in Linehan's skills manual, she identifies for substance use these 3 states of mind. They're kind of analogous to the 3 states of mind in DBT: emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind, the synthesis of the 2. In DBT for substance use, she expands this kind of Venn diagram concept to clean mind, and in the manual you'll see it actually says addict mind and clear mind. And the goal is actually to get to clear mind. We actually conceptualize both clean mind and substance user's mind as being both problematic. In clean mind, this is where folks come and they say, listen, I'm done. I'm not using anymore. I've hit rock bottom. The rock bottom discussion is almost always, the warning sign for clean mind. I've hit rock bottom. I can't go any lower. I'm finished with this substance, whatever their substance is. And listen, I want to actually reinforce that. Hey, that's great news. I'm glad to hear that. The risk in clean mind is that it ignores that there's actually a risk of relapse. Okay? And it actually doesn't, reality hasn't changed that much, and yet the risk of relapse remains. So clean mind is a dangerous state of mind. This is where folks will be, engage in apparently irrelevant behaviors, as Alan Marlatt would say. This is where they might take a route home past a liquor store that they often go to, right? And they find themselves in there. Or I just have a craving. I think the manual was, I just have a craving for a hamburger. And, that bar just really has a good hamburger. It wasn't about being in a bar. It's about having a good hamburger, right? These are clean mind sort of behaviors that are problematic, okay? Substance user mind or addict mind is the substance is driving everything. It is, behaviors of not telling the truth are high, getting funds to get substances are high, of course, and the substance is driving everything. We want to be striving for clear mind, which is I'm finished with the substance, I'm done with this. They may or may not have hit rock bottom, and if that even exists, which I don't think it does, and I have got to plan for knowing that I'm at risk, knowing that I'm always going to be at risk, perhaps, of this substance in the future. Now, this isn't a hierarchy, but it is a good way to think of things. So the path to clear mind is really decreasing the substance use. Now, if we're talking about opiates and opioid treatment, we're going to be using medication-assisted treatment for the most part. That gives us the best chance here. And so sometimes these things got to be planned for, of course. So decreasing substance use, okay? And then we really want to pay special attention to individuals' physical discomfort from abstaining from substances, right? This is so, so crucial. And so looking at perhaps the self-soothing skills inside DBT, for some folks it might be packing with ice with those like bone aching pain that comes from, especially withdrawing from substances, and reducing the physical discomfort attached to a withdrawal. Of course, if we're talking about alcohol withdrawal, we're not keen on using benzodiazepines in DBT, but of course, if they have alcohol withdrawal, you've got to have something that's protective against DTs and the serious consequences that happen from acute alcohol withdrawal. We want to practice and skill up on how to decrease urges and cravings. We're going to talk about that more. Decreasing options and contacts and cues to use drugs. Right? Early in abstinence phase, we've got to either change cues or restrict from cues that have typically been associated with using substances. Decreasing capitulating. Okay. Now, this I think, I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear from you if you put it in the chat or the Q&A. I think universally, I find that capitulating to using drugs is often when I'm doing a chain analysis on a lapse, the cognition that shows up is I just deserved it. I'd gone so long and I just deserved this use. I'd had this super stressful day, I just deserved this use. And that is an example of capitulating. I just have to use it. There's not a choice to not use it. It must be used. And oftentimes that specific cognition shows up on the links to the problem behavior. And then increasing the final piece around path to clear mind is increasing community reinforcement. And community reinforcement plays a huge role inside DBT because it's fairly behavioral. So you might want to think things along community reinforcement would be increasing normative activities, behavioral activation. As substance use is high, normative activities, of course, are very low. So we got to get substituting in more normative activities, time with non-users, time with people who care about our folks, who genuinely care, who are not exploitive individuals, and increasing those factors as people are early in abstinence as they're moving towards clear mind. So the DBT specific skills that are taught in the skills manual, that if you're running a DBT skills group for substance users, you've got to be tapping these, are burning bridges, urge surfing, adaptive denial, alternate rebellion, building structure, and eliminating or avoiding cues. Okay, we're going to go through most of these in turn. Let me just take a peek here. Yeah, I think we're pretty good. All right, so let's talk about just quickly decreasing physical discomfort. Okay, so this is to help reduce the risk of early dropout, prevent reuse of other substances. We want to get folks who have who are stopping opioids and opiates to be on medication-assisted treatment with quick introduction as best as possible, and load them up, particularly with DBT skills, distress tolerance, mindfulness, taking care of their physical body, the please skills. Really, many of the self-soothe skills and mapping these out are going to be really crucial on the front end of starting any MAT-based treatment within DBT. Decreasing urges and cravings. Now, urges, I'm going to skip one slide and then come back. So we want to be on high alert to urges and cravings that look a particular way. One is that it's not frequency, it's intensity. So it's a high intensity to use that has been showing up for a longer and longer duration of time. And for me, the giveaway is cravings and urges to use upon awakening. Okay, so it's not so much the frequency of urges and cravings, it is the intensity, the duration of that high intensity, and that occurs upon waking. Okay, now let's go back. So helping clients monitor using diary card or another monitoring strategy, urges to use. Normalizing that urges are going to show up. This is what happens. Of course, this is understandable. This is a psychoeducational or didactic strategy inside DBT, decreasing urges to use. Helping folks label urges and observe and describe the sensation of the urges inside their body. And, Alan Marlatt, again, he was a contributor, he was a consultant basically when DBT substance use was happening to Linehan's clinic, is using some imagery to help our clients imagine surfing above the urge. Okay, so the physical sensations are the urges and cravings to use, and using some imagery to imagine urge surfing or staying on top of these urges. And the reality is urges rise and they fall. What goes up comes down. Our bodies obey the laws of physics. And of course, we got to be structuring, helping them structure their life and helping structure the environment such when urges and cravings are high, especially morning cravings, using urge surfing. Okay, I think we've talked about this. Urges go down if they're not reinforced. How are they reinforced? By using the substance, of course. Now, early in treatment, we want to decrease the options and contacts and cues to use substances. So this is, things that are obvious in the environment that become classically conditioned, that become associated with substance use. We want to help identify those and give individuals a way of problem solving by on purpose or mindfully avoiding those cues, especially early in treatment. It's not always where we want to stay, but it is where we got to start early in treatment. Um, so, contacts cues to use substances, having folks change their phone number so people who sell drugs can't get in contact with them. Bringing in or getting rid of drug paraphernalia, drug contacts, sometimes moving houses or moving housing away from substance users, really targeting not truth telling, okay, and making public commitments to not use. These are all things that try to enhance um, decreasing contacts and cues. Now, bridge burning is something else we use. So, DBT is punchy. It is a little bit different than, you know, um, it's just different. We're punchy. So, client is in my session, and we're targeting substance use. One of the first things I'm going to say is, do you got the person you buy from? Do you got their contact information in your phone? You do. Okay. Well, let's jump on that and get rid of that contact right now. Do you have it written down anyplace else? Now, can we change your phone number? Is there a way that, is this person going to contact you to offer you substances? Has that happened in the past? How are we going to manage that? Okay. So we really actually want to jump on, strike while the iron's hot. You got your phone on you? Let's take that out. Let's delete that. Now, also decreasing cues can be changing cues as well. So if people have used in particular places, this is kind of Pavlovian classical conditioning. People have used in particular places like bathrooms or washrooms or a particular washroom. It's not going to be surprising when they go abstinence, they go to that place, so their brain's going to be cued to having higher urges to use or cravings to use substances. So we also have to figure out, okay, for those cues that we can't avoid in the front end, how do we change some of those cues? So it would not be unusual for me to recommend redecorating or decorating in a way or getting other reminder cues or getting other associations in those places where people have used substances that are more consistent either with not using or more consistent with obtaining a life worth living. Okay, so here's the thing. After Linehan ran her DBT for substance use treatment, she was a skills leader in one of the studies. Her people in her skills group came up to her and they said, Marsha, we really liked the treatment. This has been really good and really important for us. And we just thought you should know, though, that we all lie. And we all lie a lot. In fact, you can't use substances and not lie. And, I think initially Marsha was a little surprised by this. And then just as a good behaviorist, determined, well, okay, lying is behavior. So we've got to treat lying. And so we bring actually in DBT substance use a pretty substantial focus on not truth-telling behavior. Okay? Lying can sound accusatory. And there's actually an interesting dialectic that emerges within this not truth-telling behavior. Of course, not truth-telling is incompatible with abstinence. It's incompatible with recovery. So what we do is we just get very blunt about not truth-telling. And we get blunt on a couple things. One is that if you don't tell the truth, it's going to be very hard for you to get the goals that you want. How is not telling the truth to me, an advantage and a disadvantage? I might run pros and cons on that. I might use commitment strategies like devil's advocate. Well, maybe you shouldn't tell me the truth all the time. How would things turn out that way? What would be the advantage to that? Okay, and with those commitment strategies, sometimes paradoxical strategies, I want them to come back to both identifying the value of being truthful with me at minimum, and then being truthful with other individuals, especially individuals who are non-exploitive and caring in their life. So what do? Well, there's a couple ways to manage this. One is on the diary card to have just a not truth-telling or lying, yes or no, and have them circle that on their weekly diary card that they're bringing in. For folks who have a lot of difficulty with not truth-telling behavior, I can have that as a separate daily column of urges to not tell the truth, 0 to 5, and number of things that they didn't tell the truth on. And some folks are, so not truth telling that they might need to sample that by like the afternoon or the morning or something like that. And then you're going to treat it. You're going to run chains on not truth telling behavior. And what got not truth telling behavior happening? What were the emotions, the thoughts, the events, the sensations that happened in their body right up until that time where they did not tell the truth? And then what were the proximal, close, and distant consequences of not truth telling behavior? And what made them vulnerable to that? That's the essence of a chain. And we want to treat, as we identify controlling variables on the chain, not truth telling behavior. Now, I'm going to come back to this dialectical approach to not truth telling behavior, but essentially, we're going to treat it like any behavior. We're going to monitor it. We're just going to be honest about it and have them identify the value in it, and we're going to treat it when it shows up. Of course, I usually tell folks, this is the punchier piece of DBT, you can lie your way through treatment. The truth of the matter is, sometimes I'm not going to be able to know. In fact, maybe a lot of the time I'm not going to be able to know if you're being truthful or not. The reality is that it just doesn't get you closer to what you want in life, and it's not going to help you in this treatment to not be honest. I get paid the same no matter what, but I'd really like to get paid the same and see you get the things that you want out of your life. And that's why telling the truth, for me, is important. Of course, there's the option of not telling the truth. Now, this is stuff that we all think. The DBT kind of strategy is sometimes what you're thinking, not in a non-compassionate way, but it's just saying what we all know already out loud. Okay, let's talk about a little bit more about decreasing options to use for substances. So you really want to go through very carefully a cue list with individuals, where they were, who they're with, what they do when they use substances. And you will find, and I'm sure you do find, that there's lots of things that are associated with substance use, certain types of music or styles of music. Early on in treatment, we want to eliminate these or create new associations rather than kind of going about it in an unaware manner. Okay? Reducing, capitulating to use substances. So this is making the 99% effort to quit, but not 100%. Linehan gives a story of, outrunning a man-eating or person-eating elephant, and that you run into the garage and you think this is safe, but you leave the garage door open just about a centimeter or an inch or so. And that leaving it open just a little bit, that person-eating elephant's going to come up, going to get their tusk under that garage door, open it up, and eat you. So, instead what you want to do is make the 100% effort to quit and not to leave the door open, reducing the probability and the possibility of using substances both on the front door and planning for potential risks that could get you using substances on the back end. Now, community reinforcement, moving towards clear mind behavior. Employment is so protective and important for our folks, although very challenging, especially if they have a history of incarceration and many other structural disadvantages, I would say. But we want to increase, and I think of this along the lines of behavioral activation, replacement behaviors of normative functions, socializing with people who don't use substances, joining various groups, becoming involved. NAAA have their advantages, their disadvantages. Folks that connect don't connect with them. The reality is that there's a group of people typically that are going to greet you. You're going to get food, and people are going to notice if you're there or not there. There is advantage to that. In fact, early on, typically you become the door greeter when you're fresh and new. It is the idea of giving belonging or meaning inside a community, and I think for some folks this is somewhat of what works. Now, we've mentioned before that part of the challenge in this population is that they just don't attach in the same way that other clients do who might have more primary mental health problems or have mental health problems in the absence of substance use problems. And DBT actually takes the position that it's your job as a treatment provider, it's a therapeutic task to help engage reluctant clients. And some of the strategies that we use include orienting people to that this can just be a problem, that is actually a challenge sometimes to connect in treatment. And this is actually understandable, and we want to plan and find ways to offset this. So increasing contact in the first or the initial trimester of DBT. So if you're running a 12 months program, then that would be the first 4 months. You want to have more contact. And it could be contact through appropriate use of phone coaching strategies. I like to get clients and I orient them to this. I get agreement on it, advising me of skillful behavior, of doing things, of letting me know of things that they did skillfully throughout their day, including not using substances or using a DBT skill, any number of things that keeps their contact. And then I can kind of get some reinforcement on that and say, great, that was awesome. I'm so glad that you told me, you're really nailing this, something along those lines. Conducting treatment in vivo. This means sometimes going to the places that clients are. For a lot of our clients who are so reactive to negative affect and to things that elicit negative affect, sitting across from a therapist, it's too much. It's perhaps where we want to end up, maybe, but it might not be where we need to start. And so I have conducted with substance use individuals. Oftentimes, my main program is based in a hospital, an outpatient hospital setting, is we walk the grounds and we do therapy while walking. And, usually we shape into sitting and talking and having a more classic treatment session. But sometimes you just got to do what works. Shortening or lengthening therapy sessions. So if your clients find therapy sessions or treatment sessions aversive or unpleasant, then you're probably going to reward their attendance by having a shorter session. Some of your clients, if they love treatment sessions, you can lengthen the treatment session as a way of reinforcing attachment or connection to you. In conducting supportive family or friend-based network meetings, in a DBT fashion, this is really as much as possible putting the client in the center of those meetings, and you're being a consultant to them on how they want to manage those meetings, but oftentimes that can help keep clients connected. I also, of course, before I go into this slide, of course think that having a plan for when clients fall away is very, very important, okay? So I might say something in orientation or as I'm orienting to this problem. Listen, one of the challenges is that, you might fall out of contact with me. If you have a lapse, you're far away from me. Who can I contact? Where can I look for you to make contact with you to get you back to treatment? And I want to know that information. Okay, of course, we got to have treatment for ourselves, which is going to come it needs to come in DBT through the DBT consultation team. And additional clinical supervision or consultation as well. Now, this might be elementary for some folks, but I'm going to just highlight it here and now because why not? These are the assumptions that DBT operates from. And in DBT substance use, it really doesn't change. This is that people are doing the best they can. They want to improve. They also have to learn new skills and behaviors in all the contexts that they need to learn and get skills happening in their life. They can't fail DBT. Either DBT fails as a treatment or the provider fails to provide DBT adequately or some combination of the two. Okay? Number 5 is one of my favorites, and I will use these out loud with clients all the time, with people that I'm working with. People may not have caused all their problems, and unfortunately they have to solve them anyways. I usually give a car analogy with this. If someone hits your car, you might not be responsible for that. You didn't cause that to happen, but you still have to, at least in where I am, have to pay your deductible, have to call a collision repair place, get a rental car, do all sorts of things if I want my car fixed. I still have to solve the problem of my car being damaged in some ways. Okay? Individuals who have substance use problems need to be more motivated to change. And it is actually our job to help them be more motivated to change. And that the lives of people who are suicidal are unbearable as they are currently being lived. So we are going to have to help them find a way differently to live their life. Now, I'm not going to spend, just for time's sake, a lot on this slide here. In the original manual, this is outlined quite well. This is really the dialectics that are pulling you as a DBT therapist. And balancing these, figuring out where you are in the polarity of this. Okay, so the big one being oriented to change. change now, stop substances now. Let's figure out all the stuff that's interfering with how you want your life to be and oriented to acceptance. Perhaps this isn't the best time to solve this particular problem right now. Maybe we need to tolerate it. Maybe this is more my urge to solve this problem and less the client's urge. Okay? Unwavering centeredness, right? And compassionate flexibility. We have a way of doing things, and we got to employ compassionate flexibility when the situation demands that. That's why DBT is not a protocol-based treatment, but a principle-based treatment. Benevolent demanding, this is basically change now, and kind of communicating that the client has the ultimate capacity to change their life and how they want it to be, with nurturing. So these are polar extremes that we live between. This could be a whole advanced seminar on its own, I think, this slide. And we're balancing, as we're in session with our people, these different polarities in the treatment provision. Now, one of the most helpful things I've ever heard from Dr. DeMeth, and privileged to hear, is that when she would get overwhelmed, she would just remind herself, this is just behavior. Now, by just behavior, we mean emotions, we mean cognitions or thinking, we also mean actions, anything that the person does. And she would say, I just kind of ground myself as, this is just behavior, don't go beyond the facts, don't start theorizing something, assess the behavior, keep assessing. Failures in treatments are often failures in assessment. Keep assessing, find controlling variables, apply solutions, evaluate the process. Wash, rinse, repeat. And from a DT perspective, this is, I would say, a real saving grace in how we got to operate and conceptualize the multiplicity of problems that people bring into our session. So just a reminder, behavioral assessment is we got to have a very clear understanding, a factual understanding, an observable understanding of what the behavior is, the topography, what it looks like, the frequency, that's the count, the intensity, and the duration. Okay, we need contextual factors as well. Who was there? Where did this behavior occur? Temporal factors, like when in time did this happen? And ultimately, when we're looking at behavioral assessment analysis and solution analysis, the idea is to change the variables and change the plot, change where it went. Now, I had an image here that I had to take off because I didn't have permission to use it, but it was Bugs Bunny. And, where he pops out of the hole and he's like, oh, geez, how did I end up here? I should have taken a left turn at, I can't remember what it is, but I should have taken a left turn somewhere. How did I end up here, right? And then the adventure goes on. Basically, the idea around behavioral assessment and analysis is to figure out how did we get from point A to problem behavior B, okay? And yes, Albuquerque. I thought it was that, but I had a moment of doubt. Thank you on the chat, Gina, for advising me of that. So we want to figure out, how did we get to this place and why didn't we take a left turn at Albuquerque? Okay. So chain analysis is just so fundamental to DBT. My observation of watching lots and lots of DBT sessions, both as an adherence coder and as a supervisor and as a consultant, is that oftentimes individuals doing DBT are not doing chains particularly well, or they're not doing chains when chain analysis are needed. Okay, and a chain analysis is beyond the purview of this seminar. I'm hoping that people know what chain analysis are. If you feel like, I actually don't know if I'm doing chain analysis well or properly, that's a good time to get some very, specific expert consultation. The better you do chains, the more you're doing chains, as the manual says, the better your outcomes are going to be. Okay, so the idea of a chain analysis is to uncover the controlling variables that are controlling a problem behavior and why more skillful behavior did not occur. The reality is we're only going to get about 2 or 3 potential controlling variables that we can work on in a session with solution analysis. Okay, and our clients are going to set off to do whatever the client and I we agree on in terms of the solution analysis, and they're going to try that out the next time in a similar situation, or try that out in between the time that we meet again. We are tailoring very specific relapse prevention to the very specific controlling variables that were influencing that behavior happening. For time's sake, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on here because I really want to get to solutions and example of chain. But all behavior, whether it is substance use, whether it is lying, whether it is self-injurious behavior, whether it is, hooking up, binging or purging, it doesn't really matter what the behavior is. It is typically falling into one of these six criteria as a function, how it's working. It is often either working to gain access to a tangible reinforcer. It might be to obtain access or gain access to attention through adult or peer staff. This can be sometimes what's called suicide communication is often under this category, expressing suicidal statements. Often gets people to descend on you real fast and get a lot of attention. Some of which is helpful, and oftentimes some of which is not. Access to sensory stimulation, not so much in our population, but in individuals who are maybe not neurotypical, might do certain behaviors to obtain sensory stimulation. The vast majority of our folks, though, are going to be escaping from emotions, thoughts, and private distressing experiences, either from withdrawal or from negative affect or from negative emotions. Can be that behaviors function to escape from demanding social situations or other difficult tasks. So you want to be thinking, what is the function of this behavior as you're assessing? The function is really demonstrated mostly by the consequences. And so if you look here, this is a little chain analysis, sort of a chain analysis. Chain analysis always has these 5 components of a prompting event. Prompting event in DBT is always external to the individual. Okay, so if a substance use occurred, I want to find out what the prompting event was. What got this substance use happening? What do you think occurred? Now, I'm not looking for a thought. I'm not looking for an emotion that might be on the chain to it. I'm looking for an external event or situation. So it could be a text. Well, it could be a substance user or a substance seller. A text shows up. Are you interested? All right. That could be a prompting event. That's external to the individual. So it always has a prompting event. It has the links on the way to the problem behavior, the target behavior. Sometimes you'll see problem target behavior used interchangeably. For many of our people, it's not a problem for them, but it is a target often of treatment. And then the consequences of what happened inside of them, which are often more close or proximal consequences and distant consequences. And I'll just highlight here the links, okay? Now, I've fiddled with this. I think I've come up with it. E-cause. So that's the links between the prompting event and the target behavior. Could be emotions, cognitions, including images, actions, urges, okay, urges to do something, sensations, physiological sensations in the body, and other external events. And if you look here at this diagram, essentially we have a set of solutions for each of these link problems. So for emotion, it is likely going to be some form of informal emotion exposure. It's at least going to be a motion-based solution. For cognition, cognitive modification. That cognition that shows up, I just deserve to use. That's going to be, if that is on the chain, we think, hey, listen, we've just done this whole chain. It's on my whiteboard. It's on the back of this paper. We've worked on this together. Do you think this, I just deserve to use, do you think that influences you using? They say yes, then that's probably going to be, in my mind at least, is going to be one of the targets that we're going to focus on. Events, sensations, actions. And each of these have a corresponding set of things that we can do in relation to. We can insert a DBT skill in between a link, okay? We can do exposure on sensations, and we can do replacement behaviors on actions. Oftentimes, the replacement behavior is going to be getting the function of the behavior without the problematic nature of it. So in self-injurious folks, we're often facilitating a more functional emotional escape to bring down high emotional arousal by using on purpose a distress tolerance skill without the problematic nature of tissue damage or killing oneself. Now, here's another thing that's very important to remember is you can always do a chain analysis on urges. Okay, so high urges that, change in urges, typically a 3-point change in urge for suicide, self-injury, or for substance use, I'm going to run a chain on that if it's the highest order target. Someone's used, that's a higher order target. Someone's self-injured, that's a higher order target. So, I'm not going to be able to run 4 chains on a 60-minute session. So you got to pick your highest order target from the hierarchy, the DBT targeting hierarchy. Now, this slide here is not an exhaustive list of potential solutions, but it does give you a way of pairing what the potential controlling variable is and some potential DBT solutions that we're going to be structuring in. Okay, so for prompting events, we're often using problem solving, vulnerability factors problem solving, the please skills. Emotions and physical sensations are often going to be an exposure strategy. It could be opposite to emotion action. Sometimes it could be a very deep validation inside of a session on an emotion and having the client actually engage in self-validation as well in there. We got lots of stuff on cognition. The big ones in DBT are contingency clarification. If this happens, then this is the result. That's contingency clarification. And then we're often really targeting extreme language, judgmental language, non-dialectical thinking, very black and white, dichotomist. We're not looking for gray. We're looking for plaid with these folks. We're looking for the both and in getting to dialectical thinking. The strategies of cognitive diffusion, which is really treating cognition a lot like a behavior therapist would. So, this is probably one of my more default cognitive strategies, which is to say, if we might not have control of this thought showing up, but if you stop believing that every thought you have is a fact, do you think it would influence this target behavior less? So how can we maybe think about this thought more like something that your brain automatically generated, but get some distance from it? I might use any number of dialectical strategies or metaphors or perhaps some experiential stuff to help folks get distance from the controlling nature of the language in their brain, which is what cognition is. And then, of course, contingency management. Now, contingency management can happen in a lot of different ways. For the most part, we want our clients to be changing the consequences of the behavior. Okay, so they might actually go into their environment and say, listen, if I've been clean today, I'm going to put a check mark, on this whiteboard that I'm clean. And, that might just be a cue for you, mom or dad or caregiver or spez, to, provide some extra reinforcement, maybe give some more attention or inquire more about my day, that sort of thing. And if that check mark's not there, then you're not providing reinforcement. We want reinforcement on adaptive, on-target behavior. Now, of course, a lot of our folks often get reinforced accidentally for problematic target behavior. Oftentimes when our clients are in withdrawal and they're not using, is the times that people don't want to be around them, or at least people that care about them might not want to be around them. And they might be confusing withdrawal with use. They might think withdrawal is use. So we've got to help them get into their environment and change the consequences that follow a target behavior. Oftentimes, contingency management is obtaining the function of the behavior without the behavior. Okay, so in high urges to use and bone-crushing pain that happens with substance use, okay, think of this for a moment, using distress tolerance skills, maybe packing in ice or holding, your hand under cold water, things like that that help reduce the physiological distress, is providing escape from the physiological distress without the introduction of the substance. This is a form of contingency management. Contingency management, just fancy word for consequence management. Okay. Now listen, I like this because I think it's helpful. When you're doing off-hour skills coaching, or if you're doing in-session skills coaching, Julie Brown, who's this very wise PhD social worker, came up with this rule, so full credit to her, which is to get your clients to inquire, what is your emotional intensity right now, 0 to 5. You'll find DBT really uses a lot of 0 to 5 sort of scales, okay? You're going to add 1 to that number, and that's how many skills they're probably going to need to get through a difficult situation, okay? So, I like this. I love this for skills coaching. What is your emotional intensity right now? It's a 4. Okay, what's the crisis? I get a little snapshot on the crisis. All right, I'm thinking we need 5 specific skills to get through this crisis, to tolerate this until we can really fix it or work on it inside our session. All right, that's the 1+ rule. For many of our folks, they're going to need the 5-minute rule, which is making an inner commitment to use or to not use only for 5 minutes, and then making another commitment to not use after 5 minutes, using timers and things like that to get through a high-risk situation. This might also be a good time for the DBT substance use skill of adaptive denial, where you might pair cravings to use with something that is not a problematic thing to do. So it might be running, for example, though don't go running where you've used substances in the past, or vigorous exercise. So when a craving to use comes up, instead of being like, oh, I got to use this so bad, you say, oh, I got to go running so bad. I got to get this vigorous exercise, and oh my gosh, I'm going to feel so terrible unless I use exercise. I got to get it right now. And so you help them actually pair some other behavior to their craving that is not using substances. Could also help in a crisis situation. We don't want to deny cravings forever because in the long term it's going to increase use. But in the short term, to get through a crisis can be a very helpful skill. And perhaps, since the new manual has been released, the tip scale of using temperature on the face, I'm just going to wrap this up real fast. Temperature on the face is in this mask area. You have to hold your breath and you have to bend. This gets the parasympathetic nervous system happening and decreases emotional arousal. Actually, lots of arousal. It's hard to even think in that practice. Doing 4 to 6 times of 20 to 30 seconds of getting that cold compress, bending at the waist, holding the breath. Tense exercise, progressive muscle relaxation, paced breathing can also be your really, when your emotional arousal is too high to think, your go-to skill. I'm going to give you guys a cue right now just as I go through this very, very fast on questions that you have to pop them in there so I can respond to them. I didn't get many at the break. I'm just going to highlight that the original substance use program did have urine screens, ideally 3 times a week. Ideally, everybody gets the result, that this is not a secretive sort of thing that's going, and that's not contingent on medication-assisted treatment, whether or not they test positive or not. The dialectic around not truth-telling or lying is to, if your client insists, that this test, for example, came back positive, and they didn't use, it's to really take them very, very seriously. I might be like, we have got to figure out why that false positive came back. Is the lab's equipment calibrated? We should call them. We should figure this out. What did you eat? Is there cross-contaminants that might have got this positive? So you can actually extend or really take your client very, very seriously around truth-telling behavior as the balance, of course, where you might think, well, maybe they're not telling the truth. You can take them very, very seriously on telling the truth and see what happens. Okay, is there some questions that might be percolating? We do have some references as well, things you can certainly follow up on, key chapters, and of course the original DBT manual is going to be your friend, and the new skills training manual as well. I'll make a little plug for Portland DBT. Okay, I see something lit up here. Oh, it's a compliment. Thank you. Yes, the PowerPoint is going to be available. My understanding is after there's a date. I think it's maybe a week away or so before they might be available. August 13th. The PowerPoint will be available. Yeah, I'm not sure. The question is, what's the success rate on long-term sobriety using DBT substance use 3 years, 5 years out? I'm not sure if there's studies that have gone that far out. Naturally, the protective factors around some of what brings people into treatment is going to modulate that to some extent, as well as the use of attachment strategies, how well people attach and get back into more normative non-use behavior. So all the DBT substance use, the question was, what's the time frame or number of sessions? DBT substance use was a 12-month treatment, and it was weekly individual session, weekly skills training for 2.5 hours, and off-hours phone coaching. So that's what most of the studies have been based on. There's some question about whether or not we can get similar results in 6 months, and that is still a bit of an empirical question to get sorted. There is a handful of studies looking at that right now. I think, more specifically, if the question is how long does it take to get working, oftentimes a lot of target behavior, if using DBT properly, is going to come under some behavioral control within about 12 weeks or so. And in DBT for substance use, you're really going to have to front load a lot of skills on the front end because substance use is such a high occurring behavior, even more so than relying on chain analysis and solution analysis. So that would be my other strong suggestion, thing to bear in mind. Well, listen, thank you all. You've made this presentation wonderful, and I hope that you will go forth and use DBT in substance use treatment.
Thank you, Chris, for your time today and for your knowledge. It was a very good webinar, so thank you so much for your time. And so now we would like to conclude today's webinar. Your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADA's new website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CE to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you'll be directed onward to the evaluation. You may consider using the same email address when you register for webinars through our WebEx link, and then you set up your profile in FADA's system. This helps connect your attendance and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email. The sender will be Messenger at WebEx. Evaluation will close at midnight on Tuesday, August 13th. And for those who are wondering on the PowerPoint, that will be posted after the evaluation has been closed on August 13th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day, and please hold for the evaluation.